Book 9, Surrendering to God's Will in Trials and Tribulations. Welcome to this video on Book 9 of the Treatise on the Love of God by St. Francis de Sales. In this book, St. Francis focuses on a key aspect of our spiritual journey, the union of our will with God's permissive will. As Christians, we often hear about the importance of following God's commandments and counsels. But in Book 9, St. Francis helps us understand the deeper significance of embracing not only God's declared will, but also His permissive will, particularly when it involves trials, sufferings, and even sins. Let's dive into what it means to unite our will with God's permissive will and how this surrender allows us to grow in holiness, patience, and love even in the most difficult circumstances. Understanding God's permissive will. In the first chapter of Book 9, St. Francis begins by explaining the difference between God's absolute will and His permissive will. While God's absolute will is infallible and governs the universe, His permissive will allows for the existence of suffering, trials, and even sin, although He never directly wills sin. This permissive will respects our human freedom while also using every event, good or bad, to accomplish His greater plan for our sanctification. St. Francis de Sales invites us to reflect on how nothing happens without God's permission. This includes even the hardest trials we face in life, such as illness, failure, or the loss of loved ones. These trials, while painful, are part of God's broader plan and should be accepted with trust. He reminds us that just as roses have thorns, every moment of joy in life comes with challenges. Yet, even in these challenges, God's mercy is always present, guiding us to growth and transformation. Trials, pathways to union with God's will. In the second chapter, St. Francis explores the nature of trial and how they relate to our union with God. He uses the example of Moses' staff, which turned into a serpent when cast on the ground, but became a miraculous wand in Moses' hand. Similarly, trials appear frightening when seen apart from God's will, but when understood as part of His permissive will, they become opportunities for grace and spiritual growth. The soul that loves God learns to embrace these trials, seeing them as ladders to heaven. This is why St. Francis calls afflictions golden when viewed through the lens of divine love. He gives the example of Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, and the martyrs who embraced suffering because they saw God's permissive will behind it. For those who love God, trials become a precious means of drawing closer to Him, purifying the soul and strengthening our love. Resignation and holy indifference. One of the central themes in Book 9 is the concept of resignation to God's will. St. Francis explains that resignation involves accepting God's will in all things, not just when it brings comfort and joy, but especially when it brings suffering or hardship. This act of surrender is a powerful form of love because it requires us to let go of our own desires and trust fully in God's providence. In the fourth chapter, St. Francis introduces the idea of holy indifference, which takes resignation even further. Holy indifference is the state of the soul that is completely indifferent to whether God's will brings consolation or suffering. The indifferent soul only desires what God desires, regardless of personal preference. This kind of love is disinterested, meaning that it seeks nothing for itself but purely desires to fulfill God's will. St. Francis uses the example of saints like St. Paul, who expressed no preference between life and death as long as God's will was accomplished. God's will in the everyday moments. As we move through Book 9, St. Francis emphasizes that uniting our will with God's permissive will must extend into every aspect of our lives. Whether we are facing illness, financial hardship, or success, we are called to practice holy indifference. This means that we do not cling to health, wealth, or even spiritual consolations, but we accept whatever comes from God's hand with trust and love. One of the most beautiful examples St. Francis gives is the story of St. Louis, King of France, and his wife. St. Louis prepared for a great journey to the Holy Land, and his wife accompanied him. When asked where she was going, she answered, "I do not care where I am going as long as I am with my husband." In the same way, the soul that is united with God's will does not care what happens as long as it is in harmony with God's plan. Whether in sickness or health, joy or sorrow, the soul remains steadfast in its love for God. The example of saints in embracing God's will. Throughout Book 9, St. Francis points to the examples of saints who embraced God's permissive will even in the midst of great suffering. He mentions Job, who lost everything but remained faithful to God, accepting both the good and the bad that came from his hand. He also highlights the heroic example of Christ, who in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. Even as he faced the agony of the cross. St. Francis emphasizes that the greatest act of love is to embrace God's will even when it involves suffering. This is the essence of disinterested love, to love God not for the consolations He provides, but for His will alone. It is in these moments of surrender that the soul is most perfectly united with God as it learns to love Him for who He is rather than for what He gives. Conclusion: the path of surrender. In conclusion, Book 9 of the Treatise on the Love of God calls us to a deep and transformative union with God's will. St. Francis de Sales teaches us that the path to holiness is not found in avoiding suffering, but in embracing it as part of God's permissive will. By practicing resignation and holy indifference, we learn to trust that everything that happens in our lives, whether it be joy or sorrow, success or failure, is part of God's loving plan for our sanctification. As we grow in love for God, we become more like Him, aligning our will with His and finding peace even in the midst of trials. This is the heart of St. Francis's message in Book 9. True love for God means loving His will in all things, knowing that His wisdom and goodness are always guiding us toward eternal union with Him. Thank you for joining me in this reflection on Book 9. If you found this talk helpful, please share with others. God bless you. Live Jesus.
In the trials of life I find your way. Even in sorrow your will holds sway. Though pain and tears may cloud my view, I know, oh Lord, you lead me through. Your will is love, your plan is grace. In every trial I see your face. I will submit in joy and strife, for in your will I find my life. In your will I rest, oh Lord. Through every storm you are my sword. I trust in your permissive plan. Lead me, guide me, hand in hand. In your will my heart will stay. I love you, Lord, through night and day. The trials come, but I see your light. You turn my sorrow into flight. With Abraham's faith I hold my son. Your will be done, your will be done. Your will is love, your plan is grace. In every trial I see your face. I will submit in joy and strife, for in your will I find my life. In your will I rest, oh Lord. Through every storm you are my sword. I trust in your permissive plan. Lead me, guide me, hand in hand. In your will my heart will stay. I love you, Lord, through night and day. Holy indifference in joy or pain. Your will I see, your love I gain. In sickness, health, in loss or gain. In your will I remain. In your will I rest, oh Lord. Through every storm you are my sword. I trust in your permissive plan. Lead me, guide me, hand in hand. In your will my heart will stay. I love you, Lord, through night and day. In your will, oh Lord, I trust. In love and mercy you are just.